As you might know, or maybe you don't, Deepwoken is a hardcore permadeath Roblox game that has the most character diversity that I've ever seen in basically any game, Roblox or not. I'm being real, you can make a build specifically for bombs, potions, and countering with your big brain intelligence, a one-shot assassination build perfect for sneaking up, and even an avatar build with every single element in the entire game. For sure, I'm super biased since I absolutely love this game, but if you want to be creative, Deepwoken is the game for you. What's up guys, it's Punchy, and today we discuss build diversity with a specific focus on weaponry. As I mentioned earlier, creating a character while crafting your special playstyle is very possible in the game of Deepwoken, but we can't forget our weapons. There's a time and place for basically every single option, well, most of them, but it's safe to say that all weapons are not made equally. Today, I'll be ranking every single weapon in Deepwoken in a tier list setting, with a few categories determining their worth. Again, this is just my opinion, but I've had experience for many years with this game. I'm an official Deepwoken game tester, and I've tested these weapons, and I'm constantly providing goofy builds and abusable tech for basically every single weapon as well. Of course, take my views with a grain of salt and play the game that you ultimately want to play, but I do think that this ranking can easily inform both inexperienced and veteran players what to try out and what's worth picking. As of right now, this video's content is up to date with the May 3rd, 2024 balanced patch, and it should hold up fairly well in the future unless drastic changes occur. To make it easier to view, I'll be separating the light, medium, and heavy plus elemental weapons into their own videos, and I'll combine them all the way at the end when everything is finished. Also, I'll put the tier list in the description, so if you want to share your thoughts, comment them down below. Thanks again to Myzron for the super big help. Anyway, let's begin the tier listing. We'll be discussing every single weapon in the current day Deepwoken with their respective class, starting from light weapon all the way to heavy and elemental. Keep in mind, if a weapon does have an alloy, I'll be focusing on the upgraded version instead of the base. Based on this order, we'll also be respecting 4 different weapon categories, of which I'll decide my final ranking of this weapon. First up, number 1 are the competitive stats. How fast does this weapon swing? What's the maximum damage? How does this damage scale? And how many points are required to make this weapon actually usable? It's a pretty objective and basic rating field. Next, gameplay versatility. How often is this weapon performing well? How many situations does it work in? And does this option fall off with the introduction of something else? This is more about what type of gameplay the weapon excels in and where it falls short. Third, we have weapon tech and special attributes. Does this weapon do anything crazy? Are there specific things that we can abuse or change up to our gameplay? And most importantly, how easily can this tech be abused? Instead of just using our weapons normally, we can't just do that, so let's push the limits. The final category is purely subjective, but it's really about how much fun this weapon truly is. This won't make or break where I place a weapon, but I'll definitely mention it if the option is interesting before doing anything else. Regardless of the setting, PvE or against other players, I'll be judging every single Deepwoken weapon based on its capability or potential in the game. And that's about it. To start off our ranking with a tier list breakdown, all the way at the top we have S tier, which is self-explanatory. These weapons perform well while being diverse, unique, and fun. A tier, solid and reliable picks for any type of gameplay, but they just aren't hitting that peak. B tier, decent options that can be useful in a few different situations, but aren't as capable as the others. C tier, these weapons exist. Finally, we have D tier. D stands for don't use this weapon. Either it's bad, boring, and useless, whatever it may be, you should probably never pick this up unless you're progressing a build. Underneath this, we have a special category specifically for weapons that could use a rework, buff, or unique crit. Of course, I'll still explain their viability as well, but I wouldn't consider these as great options since they're missing something vital to their kit. Now, without further ado, let's begin ranking every single Deepwoken weapon, starting with Fist. It's time for the first section, light weapons. The Drake Maul gauntlets are a viable endgame fist option introduced exclusively in the Halloween Hollowtide update. With innate bleed and slightly lower than normal swing speed, these gauntlets hit hard and can be used in basically any build that wants the combo. With a fast wind-up critical that ragdolls players, this pick has many combo starters and mantra confirms that just cannot be ignored. Although it is an event-exclusive weapon, the Drake Maul gauntlets place at a solid A tier ranking. Moving on to the Light's final toll. With a surprisingly recent gut, this willpower fist option fell from top tier since it now scales off both light weapon and willpower stats, which basically cut your stat saving in half. This legendary used to be truly powerful, but its expensive stats and well-balanced criticals leave it sitting at a solid C tier placement. It's a fun option, but it kind of just exists alongside stronger picks. Up next, we have the Flamekeeper Cestus. All I gotta say about this pick is that it's the best fist weapon with the best Cestus stats. With a surprisingly low requirement of only 65 light weapon, we hit hard with insanely fast and difficult to read animations, landing the Flamekeeper Cestus at a high S tier ranking. What more do I have to say? It's a fist weapon with very good stats, and fist weapons are some of the best in the game. Moving on to the Anklets of Ulsan. This Just Create weapon has much of the same upsides as the Flamekeeper Cestus, but this time we have a crazier fist style that's even weirder. High swing speed and ridiculous animations are a constant with the Just Create fighting style, and I forgot to mention that the Anklets have 0 requirements while granting Just Create builds a free enchant. Quite simply, you can do anything with this weapon, placing it at a high S tier ranking. Next up with the Iron Cestus. Despite this Cestus having very low damage, we do get a great point saving option that doesn't require any light weapon investment. The Iron Cestus functions as a free enchant on any fist style build, which often leads to insane cheese options that can perform well. Again, it's a free enchant while saving some points on extremely diverse builds, so I'll place this at a low to mid-level B tier option. It's still pretty good, and I've even abused this myself. Next up with the Legion Cestus. With a weird point investment and lackluster damage, yeah, you'll get a fist weapon, but there's 0 point in running it on a maxed out build. Seriously, either go all in using the Flamekeeper Cestus or save your points with the Iron Cestus. This drops into the depths as our first D rank rating. Finishing off the fist weapons, we have the Coral Cestus. It's a fairly new weapon with decent stats and a cool new crit which hard knockdowns and can confirm combos. Truth be told, we haven't seen the full potential of this weapon just yet, but I do have some complaints. If this weapon had a fully modifiable range for the jump and critical, I'd probably slap this at an A tier ranking, but for now, it's just a decent pick that can work in B tier. Starting off with the daggers, we have the Stiletto. Not much can be said about a starting dagger with 0 requirement and capability to enchant, but it's still a dagger with crazy speed and weird animations. At most, it's used for saving points or sparring with your friends, so I gotta put it down in D tier since there's just better options for dagger. Next up with the Gilded Knife. For some inexplicable reason, the Gilded Knife does way more damage than the Silver Dagger, a more expensive dagger option, and I just don't really know why. Regardless, it's basically a starter option that's unfortunately fodder, so we have to leave it in D tier. Moving on, we have the previously mentioned Silver Dagger. Again, it's almost a carbon copy of other starter daggers, but there's something weird going on. With a higher stat requirement than the Gilded Knife, it does way less damage, so we'll simply place this 1 spot lower than the Gilded Knife, also in D tier. After this, let's talk about the Knorr Fang. With a surprisingly cool design alongside a decent penetration bonus, I want this weapon to be much more. Unfortunately, there's no point in picking this up since it's just outclassed. This tool is missing a unique critical and doesn't perform well, so I'm just gonna start off our first pick in the needs rework or needs critical category. Next up with the Alloyed Wailing Knife. This dagger is one of the greats, dealing nutty damage with a very fast crit. It's not an understatement to consider this weapon as viable, but sadly it's been thrown to the side by the introduction of the new Cerulean Thread, which takes everything it has and just does it better. I'm placing the Wailing Knife at a high A tier placement. Moving along, we have the Champion's Dagger. This weapon realistically isn't bad, but if you're looking in the strongest category of weapons, there will always be a better pick. It looks cool, but gets easily left behind. Another dagger down in D tier because there's no point in using a weaker option that has nothing special. On to the Central Dirk. I just talked about this dagger, but in summary, it's extremely powerful with a very specific build. As the fastest dagger with the highest range of 7.0, we can do some stupid setups to abuse our hitbox. Alongside Phantom Edge, we're using a Central Dirk with a 7.25 range and the crazy dagger crits, which is insane. With great stats and cheese capability, we'll place the Central Dirk at a mid B tier ranking. Talking about some classics, we now have the Alloy Tonto. It's the other dagger with 7.0 range, but this thing hits hard and snipes players alongside a decent swing speed. It's also worth mentioning mentioning, it's the only dagger with 0-second end lag, which is busted. Unfortunately, I do have to slap the Tonto in a solid A tier position because the cerulean thread is just so good, it would be a disservice to place the Tonto at the same level. Moving on to the Nemet Sickle. This dagger has uniquely high penetration with a very low damage. I won't lie, it could use a special unique critical, a range buff, or even an alloy, so I'll just leave it in the needs rework section. Next up, with our first legendary dagger, we have the Flare Blood Kamas. Right off the bat, these things have crazy damage, fast swing speed, and a ranged critical that's nearly unpunishable. Even if you parry this thing, a successful Flare Blood crit can combo into mantras, Manikati at a distance, which cannot be ignored, like it's busted. Although the intelligence investment required could stunt some builds, I gotta place the Flare Blood Kamas at a solid S tier ranking. It's an outstanding weapon that works on many builds. Onto something recently updated, we have the Cerulean Knife. A classic Deepwoken weapon, this option has the potential for greatness with a highly abusable crit with insane versatility. With several tools and tech to harness, if you're really pushing the Cerulean to the maximum, I'd rank this as a low A tier dagger, but if not, it's probably a solid B tier pick. Next up, with the Curse Edge. I won't lie, this dagger is highly consistent, only rivaled by a few different daggers. The damage and pen are solid, great for specific builds that spec into consistent combos and reliable damage. Although it's decent, I'd say it's rivaled by better options like the Alloy Tonto and Cerulean Thread, leaving the Curse Edge at a lower A placement. Finally, the peak of poking, it's time for the Cerulean Thread. With insanely high damage alongside a 25% pen, the Cerulean just outstats every other option. The crit does crazy damage while slumping players and proccing talents, since it simply has double the capability of the Wailing Knife. The Cerulean Thread is a high S tier weapon that works and excels on any endgame dagger build. Starting off the Rapier section with a starter Rapier, we have the Quick Fang. This weapon requires absolutely zero light weapon investment, resulting in a fast Rapier that can be enchanted for specific cheese builds. Surprisingly, it's almost better than the Apprentice Rapier, which is more expensive, but there's little reason to actually use the Quick Fang, so I'ma put it at a D tier ranking. Moving on, I just introduced this option, the Apprentice Rapier. Once again, it's basically a starter option with barely more damage than the Quick Fang, which has no requirement, so it simply falls behind. Don't run this Rapier on your final build. Up next, with the Inquisitor's Rapier. During the introduction of this Rapier, the weapon class itself needed mid-level options to fully integrate into Deepwoken, leaving the Inquisitor's Rapier kinda confused and forgotten. Sadly, it's a progression pick that's vastly outstatted on endgame builds, resulting in a D tier placement. Moving on to the Crucible Rapier. Despite my previous thoughts on mid-level, I guess, filler options, this Rapier isn't that bad. With decent pen and alright damage, all it's really missing is some range to boost it up. Although it's simply okay, 75 light weapon requirement is extremely wasteful and stands as its greatest limitation. I'll place the Crucible Rapier at a solid C tier ranking since it still can be used. Up next, with our endgame Rapiers, we have the Cursed Streza. As one of the two final options that many people pick, this thing works well with a solid speed demon build. Although this is a great weapon pick, Rapiers have been nerfed heavily with the removal of multiple enchant procs on crits and posture removal as well. So the Cursed Streza sits nicely as a solid B tier pick. People do use it, but it doesn't stand out in my opinion. Moving on to the last Rapier, the Skull Piercer. This option functions as a consistent Rapier with 100% innate bleed damage and ridiculous range. Although the Cursed Streza can reach greater damage with the use of Speed Demon, the Skull Piercer is easier to use for a less experienced player. Considering what you value more, consistency or max damage, this pick is either one in front or one below the Cursed Streza down in B tier. Starting off our guns, we have the starter option, the Silver Six. Back in the day, this was the go-to pick for builds that wanted an offhand spacing tool. Like seriously, you could proc talents, shoot bullets, and snipe players from a distance, but now that's been removed. It's still cool and can be used without a weapon investment, but that won't really save the Silver Six from its D tier ranking. Next up, we have the Flintlock, a pirate gun that's a classic in my opinion. Much like the previous Silver Six, in theory, you could probably make a cheese build using this weapon, but I don't think it performs well at an endgame level, and you are wasting 20 stat points that could be used on anything. point. The flintlock is a D tier pistol and shouldn't be used on your final build. Finally, onto something decent, we have the revolvers. No matter what type of gun style you're playing with, this is one of the highest DPS options in the entire game. I'm not gonna lie, guns are pretty insane with their projectile shots, and for some reason, the revolver itself has 12 range. All revolvers benefit from bullet pen talent, damage multipliers, and spacing, putting this endgame weapon at a solid A tier placement. It's fast and reliable on any gun build. Next up with the Dragoon. I'll be honest, this weapon is interchangeable with the revolver with slightly adjusted stats. With more damage and slower firing speed, it hits hard, but it does have a little bit less overall DPS. Again, it's not gonna make or break your build unless you got something very specific going on, so I'll slap this right next to the revolvers at a solid A tier ranking. Moving on to something new, we have the Alloy Dawn Shot. I'm not gonna lie, this is very similar to the revolver and performs well in basically the same situations. The stats are kinda negligible, but it is worth mentioning that this gun is very big, so maybe you like this. Design-wise, I prefer this more than the revolver, but it stands right next to it in the weapon placement at A tier. Alright, for right now, that's all I have to say about light weapons, and for part 1 of the giant Deepwoken weapon tier list, I'll pause it right here. Of course, if you want to see the next part, hopefully next week I'll do medium weapons, and that should be coming out soon. Again, when all parts are finished, I'll combine all 3 into one video so it's easier to understand, and I'll fix things if balancing comes into play or a new weapon gets introduced. If you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe so I can reach 85k subs. Thanks again, it's Punchin' time.